Winter, 2018, the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. Stories would begin to circle in the local media that caused some concern with many of the inhabitants, as numerous sightings began to pour in about a woman walking alone down the R504 Kolyma Highway, or known to the locals as Road of Bones, named that because of allegations that numerous imprisoned laborers died building the road and were buried under it, somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million. Now, just why is a random woman walking down the highway such a big deal? Well, it has to do with location. This highway stretches through Siberia, where in the winter months it gets dangerously cold, and it's not suitable to be walking up and down the highway, especially when you consider it's one of the most desolate highways in the world, and if someone had a medical emergency, it might be a while before anyone noticed. It's because of this, numerous drivers would pull over and ask the woman if she needed a lift, sometimes trying to insist she get in because of the danger she faced. However, the woman, whose name is unknown but might be Ludmila, would not even respond to their offers. The woman, whoever she was described as having a Slavic appearance and apparently told some people she was from Kazakhstan and was on her way to Kamchatka. The police were notified, but obviously they couldn't intervene or anything because she had not broken any laws. But still, many wanted the authorities to step in and do something because they were so worried that she would die on the road. To this day, the woman is unknown, and why she chose to walk along this desolate highway in some of the most dangerous temperatures in the world is also unknown. But most suspiciously, no one knows what happened to her. December 6th, 1978, 11:30 p.m., Genoa, Italy. 26-year-old night watchman Pier Fortunato Zanfretta was on his routine patrol when suddenly his car's engine, lights, and radio all died at the same time. This was awful timing considering the roads were already dangerously icy. This would obviously annoy anyone, but while he was trying to figure out if his battery had died, he looked up to see 4 moving lights in the backyard where a garden sat. The garden and home belonged to a Dr. Ettore Righe, and he was the one that had hired Zanfretta to look over the property, or I should say, hired the company he worked for. And since Zanfretta knew the cottage was unoccupied that night, he immediately suspected the 4 lights were that of flashlights being carried by intruders. So he jumped into action. He pulled out his revolver and began to move towards the lights. He quietly slipped through the open gate and crept along a rock wall, and as he got close enough to jump out on the would-be burglars, he felt a touch on his shoulder from behind. He quickly spun around with his revolver, but he could never be prepared for what he's seen next. There in front of him was this ugly green being staring right at him. He was a giant too, close to 10 feet tall, and had yellow triangular eyes with big thorn-like appendages growing out of the side of his head. He also had clawed feet, and most suspiciously, his skin appeared as if it was pretty fat, or like he was wearing a rumpled suit. But that wasn't the worst of it. There were 4 of these things, not just one. Their mouths looked like they were made of iron, and they had red veins on their heads and pointed ears and arms. Finally, he noted a breathing apparatus being worn over their mouths, suggesting they didn't breathe oxygen. Zanfretta would do like anyone, and he got the heck out of there, running as fast as he could back to his car. But as he was running, he peeked over his shoulder to see this massive triangle-shaped aircraft, although it was hard to make out with the light blinding him. So he held up his hands to block as much light as possible and seen a huge UFO, which he claimed was even bigger than the house. It began lifting up from the backyard of the home, making a hissing sound in the process. Zanfretta was then hit with a wave of heat, but he continued to run to the car, finally making it and jumping inside. He quickly grabbed the car's radio and called the security company radio operator at 12:15 a.m., a Carlo Toccolino, who would later testify that Zanfretta was speaking in a confused and agitated fashion, so much so that he could only discern so much of it, because it mostly sounded like Zanfretta was babbling. Although he did hear him describing the beings, Carlo was not sure what was going on, and he asked who was assaulting him, and Zanfretta replied, "No, they aren't men. They aren't men. My God, are they ugly?" And mysteriously, the communication stopped. By now, the supervisor was contacted, a Lieutenant Giovanni Casaba, and he was pretty concerned about what was going on, not only for his employees' sake, but also because they wanted to make sure nothing happened at their client's property, whom I assume was paying quite a hefty sum to hire a private security firm to guard his property. So the lieutenant sent out a patrol car to check on Zanfretta, but because the roads were so bad due to the ice, the patrol car didn't make it for another hour. But when they did arrive, the two other guards got out and started searching around the home. They quickly found Zanfretta lying on the frozen ground in front of the home. When he saw them coming, he jumped to his feet, looking terrified, and put his flashlight and gun up to both of his co-workers. Both men would later state Zanfretta did not recognize them, and he refused to lower his weapon. The guards eventually were able to rush him and take his gun away before anyone was harmed, and that's when they made the first odd discovery. Although Zanfretta had been laying on the frozen ground for an hour, he was pretty warm. The guards were actually pretty shook up by the entire thing, and actually called the police to come over to the scene. They would begin searching the area, and soon they found these immense imprints in the backyard. He was about 9 foot in diameter and shaped like horseshoes, and many later speculated he came from the triangular-shaped UFO Zanfretta claimed to have seen, most likely the landing gear. By the next day, the news began to spread, and before long, the local police commander would be questioned about the whole event, and of course, whether Zanfretta was mentally stable. The commander's answer was kind of a surprise. He stated he believed every bit of Zanfretta's testimony and found him to be a clear-thinking man. And curiously enough, the police took it seriously, and they began to question people in the area and found out that an additional 52 witnesses claimed to have seen a bright glaring illumination coming from the direction of the home that night. By this point, the media began to hear about the story, and reporters began showing up in the small town. And unsurprisingly, the coverage varied from being skeptical to outright mocking Zanfretta. Some straight up said he was lying about the entire thing, but there was one reporter, a Reno Di Stefano, who took an interest in the case, and he began to cover it, writing many articles about it. He, for one, could not understand why a respected husband and father, as well as being respected by his peers, would jeopardize his career and reputation to make up such a crazy story. He decided to go talk to him and find out more. He quickly found out that Zanfretta hated his newfound fame, and he hated being recognized in public, and most of all, he hated being known as the man who had this strange encounter. The whole ordeal made him worry about losing his high-paying job and his ability to support his family. He would even tell the reporter he was now constantly getting prank phone calls, which was taking a toll on him, since they called at all times of the day and night. Having said that, he would not take anything back. He stated what he had told was not a lie, and that the events happened as he portrayed them. By the 23rd, 2 weeks later, he had convinced Zanfretta to go be put under hypnosis to try and find out more about what really happened that night. And by this point, Zanfretta thought, what do I have to lose? So he went ahead and done it. During the session, Zanfretta was now able to clearly recall more. He now remembered that not only had he seen these beings, but they had abducted him. Apparently, they transported him onto a hot, luminous location where they examined him and then began interrogating him. They couldn't speak Italian, obviously, but used a strange device to translate between the two. That's when Zanfretta was met with the startling revelation. These beings were from a planet called Titonia, which was located in the 3rd galaxy, and most disturbingly of all, they wanted to talk with mankind and would return in larger numbers. So this is pretty big revelations, right? But at least it was over, and Zanfretta could move on with his life. Except, that's not what happened, because just 3 nights after this hypnosis session, Zanfretta would be driving his patrol car around 11:45 p.m. when he suddenly lost control of the vehicle. He grabbed for the radio and called the station to let them know the car was driving itself, and he was hitting the brakes and trying to steer, but the vehicle continued to roll along through a tunnel, out into the fog, and up a steep incline. The car then drove about a mile before coming to a jarring stop, one that slammed Zanfretta forward and caused him to hit his head on the steering wheel. And just as he was trying to figure out what was going on, the car became immersed in a white hot light. Zanfretta now called back and strangely seemed pretty calm, stating, "The car has stopped. I saw a bright light. Now I am getting out." And again, his fellow guards would be dispatched, and just like last time, they couldn't make it to him until around 1:10 a.m., finding Zanfretta in a field near a road, and despite the pouring rain, he was dry and warm, but he was also in a state of shock, quivering and weeping. Zanfretta would look up at his two co-workers and state, "They say I must leave with them. What about my children? I don't want to. I don't want to." This shook the men up, and they promptly called the police, who arrived and began their own investigation, and they found out something odd almost immediately. Even though it was cold and rainy, one of the officers happened to touch the top of Zanfretta's Fiat and realized it was very hot, almost as if it had spent hours baking in the sun. So he opened the car door and stuck his head inside to discover it was hot as an oven. If that wasn't weird enough, the police would also see these really huge boot prints that surrounded the vehicle. They were 20 inches long and 8 inches wide. Each print had a distinctive bare spot between the sole and heel. This would actually end up being one of the most critical pieces of physical evidence ever left at a scene of an alleged alien abduction. Next, the detectives would look at Zanfretta's revolver and soon realized he had fired it 5 times, and Zanfretta could not remember whom or what he had shot at. Because of this, and because of the public attention now on the case, authorities wanted an investigation into the whole bizarre saga, and about a week later, on January 3rd, 1979, the data on the case would be put into a file and labeled as Report on the Sighting of Unidentified Flying Objects by Fortunato Zanfretta. It was then forwarded to the court, where it would sit until a decision was made on what should be done next. But unfortunately, no one wanted to touch the case, for obvious reasons. But after a year of kicking it back and forth to different authorities, it was finally picked up by Magistrate Russo, who declared it should be put away and marked as no crime committed. I should also note here that this investigation had actually been carried out by the Carabinieri, which is one of the main law enforcement agencies of Italy. It's kinda like a hybrid agency, maybe the equivalent of the FBI and US Marshal Service with a little mix of National Guard. But why this is important is because it would be revealed that during their correspondence with the Italian Department of the Interior, they had sent 2 telexes just days after, which said the degree of reliability that these events actually occurred was good. Many have pointed to this as being legit proof that something involving extraterrestrials really happened. However, others point out that this was a time when UFO sightings in Italy were already at a fever pitch. It was so crazy that a former member of the parliament asked both Italy's premier and Minister of Defense to address the Congress about their opinion of the sightings. Meanwhile, Zanfretta's employer was becoming concerned by all the publicity, not to mention the mental health of their employee, and they asked a prominent neurologist, a Dr. Giorgio Giannotti, to examine Zanfretta, who found he was perfectly fine. This led to Zanfretta accepting the offer to undergo hypnosis once again, and this time he would be televised in an effort to prove he was not insane. Zanfretta would go on to give many more details about the night's events, such as being stripped and forced by the abductors to wear a strange helmet, which according to him allowed him to understand their language, but also caused him great pain. He also remembered one of the aliens taking his gun and firing bullets into a panel, probably to see if human weapons could harm them. He then told the hypnotist his fear of having to leave his home and family behind, as the beings wished to take him with them. While this sounds insane, a ton of people in Italy actually watched this interview, but unfortunately for Zanfretta, it had the opposite effect. It only increased the criticism of his account, while skeptics tore him apart. After this, Zanfretta would become a recluse, for about half a year anyways, when on July 30th, 1979, he would be on his motorcycle patrolling yet again, by this time far from the areas where the weird encounters had taken place, and this time, he strangely just vanished. And again, his fellow guards were dispatched to find him, to which they did, after 2 hours of searching, and this time, Zanfretta was on a summit of a nearby mountain. How he got here is unknown, because all of the potential local eyewitnesses in the area stated they had not seen a young guard on a motorcycle. What makes that odd was this was a desolate area with only one road that went up the mountain, and any residents here would have almost had to see him passing through, and would have no doubt heard the motorcycle. Again, Zanfretta would seek help, this time from the International Center of Medical and Psychological Hypnosis, and he actually requested a professor there, a Marco Marchesin, to inject him with sodium pentothal, better known as truth serum. While under its effects, Zanfretta would state he had been lifted from the ground into the alien spaceship via a mysterious green light, which is probably the least strange thing about this whole account. Following the procedure, Professor Marchesin would state that no human could knowingly lie while under sodium pentothal treatment, and he believed it was highly probable Zanfretta actually had these encounters. But unfortunately, for poor old Zanfretta, his nightmare wasn't over, because fast forward 6 months to December 2nd, 1979, and Zanfretta disappeared again in the suburbs. But this time, things would play out a little bit stranger, because as his security co-workers were dispatched to find him once again, the 4 men would have their own strange encounter. They would report a strange cloud-like object floating above them, and then suddenly 2 beams of light seemed to emerge from within that cloud and lit up the patrol cars below. And crazily enough, the vehicle's engines stopped dead in their spot, and the 4 guards got out to see what was going on and spotted the UFO. Apparently, Lieutenant Casaba, whom we mentioned earlier, Zanfretta's supervisor, became so frightened by the whole thing that he took his pistol out and began firing at it. The lights then went off and the UFO left, but Lieutenant Casaba wasn't even the most frightened. That would be one of the other guards, Germano Zanardi, who apparently was traumatized so bad that he went insane, and just a few months later committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. But this still was not the end of all the craziness, because the following day, Zanfretta, whom I'm guessing they found the previous day, was on patrol again when around 9:30 p.m. he got out of his patrol car to get gas. All of a sudden, he heard someone calling out to him from the shadows beside the gas station. Zanfretta reported he was a humanoid with a bald egg-shaped head and was dressed in a checkered suit that included a chest plate made of steel where the shirt should have been. The being ordered Zanfretta to drive his vehicle into a small cloud that was hovering just above the ground, and Zanfretta did as instructed, almost as if he couldn't resist. There, his patrol car levitated within the cloud and was deposited into a huge spacecraft. Once there, the guard was allowed to explore, although the oversized alien stayed close to him. Zanfretta reported to have seen these large transparent cylinders filled with a weird blue liquid. One of these contained a frog-shaped body, which the aliens thankfully explained was an enemy of their planet. In 2 of the other cylinders, Zanfretta also seen a large bird-like creature with another humanoid he described as being caveman-like. It was around this time that these beings attempted to give Zanfretta a transparent sphere that apparently held an electrically charged pyramid inside. The aliens claimed that utilizing the sphere would enable the human beings to comprehend who they were and how they live, but Zanfretta refused, stating he had enough of these strange encounters and wished to go back to a normal life. But they insisted he take it and give it to a man named Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a scientist and most notably UFO researcher. However, Zanfretta instead hid the object in the hills near Genoa, which seems awful suspicious. And again, Zanfretta would disappear just 2 months later on Valentine's Day, 1980, and was found in a state of shock and suffering from mild hypothermia. Interestingly, a villager nearby did report seeing a huge radiant mass in the sky just minutes before the rescuers arrived. And again, a hypnotist would be summoned, and this time though, they found Zanfretta did not want to cooperate, although he eventually did, and stated that the aliens spoke an odd unknown language, and when telling the story, his voice became guttural and he uttered cryptic phrases. Things began to wind down after this, thankfully, with Zanfretta vanishing once more in August of that year, but this time, he was found quickly before any aliens could contact him. He would state decades later, though, that the aliens had began to contact him again. In 1984, a book about the case was written, which studied the 2-year-long saga of weirdness, and that brings us to theories. No doubt, it's weird and seems downright ludicrous, but the fact is, over 60 additional witnesses did report strange aerial phenomena in the exact locations and times that Zanfretta allegedly encountered these beings. That is almost absurd, and is kinda difficult to debunk, and even if it was nothing more than an asteroid or the ever so infamous swamp gas, How in the world did Zanfretta manage to be at all these places at each time and then be found under weird circumstances? There's also the investigation by law enforcement in Italy, who were all convinced he was telling the truth and something strange was happening. Likewise, what about all the hypnotists? And there's also a lot that's been made of the professor that administered the truth serum to Zanfretta and his statement that no one can lie once given that. Well, actually that's not true. Sodium pentothal only works by weakening someone's resolve and thereby makes them crack under pressure easier, so the person who is administered is more cooperative with interrogators, not to mention the fact that he allegedly got this sphere with the electrically charged pyramid inside that he was supposed to give to Dr. J. Allen Hynek, but instead took it into the woods where he still allegedly used it to contact aliens, absolutely reeks of a hoax, especially since he has never even taken a picture of it. Regardless, it's went down as one of the most famous alien encounter stories in Italy, and one of the most famous in the world. May 24th, 2004, Denver, Colorado. At the offices of Carter Douglas, an engineering consulting firm, employees noticed the absence of one of their key employees, a man named Oakey Kite, or better known as Al. As the hours wore on and he never showed up, nor bothered to call in, his coworkers and friends began to worry and decided to call and check on him. However, after several calls to him went unanswered, they decided to call his emergency contact, as this was not like Al at all, and they worried. The emergency contact would be his sister Barbara, and she would tell the office that she had not heard from Al that morning either, but unfortunately, she lived on the other side of the country in Virginia and could not drive to check on him. So she too just called Al over and over, to no avail. Now she was worried about him, and eventually, all she could do was call the Aora police to perform a welfare check. They responded late that afternoon, pulling into Al's driveway. Upon arriving, they found everything to be normal, so they got out and went up and knocked on the door, but no response. The officers started getting the suspicious feeling that something was off. They thought that maybe Al was having some kind of medical emergency, so they decided to enter the home. They walked in, and just like outside, found everything normal. After doing a sweep of the home and finding no sign of Al, they decided to walk down in the basement, and it's here they made an awful discovery. There he lay, body face down. He was deceased, but the worst part was the crime scene itself. It was incredibly gruesome. He had been tortured. There was blood on the walls and floor. Many of the hardened officers that had viewed the scene were taken aback and stated it was the worst they had ever seen. On the back of Al's head was a wound which indicated he had been struck from behind, most likely when he was walking down the basement steps in front of the killer. But it was here that his hands and feet were tied up behind his back and then tied together. From this point, Al would be tortured for at least hours, a torture that involved sharp instruments. Detectives came to the conclusion that he eventually died after being stabbed 22 times. So police would inform his family and they begin the process of trying to track down who in the world could be responsible for such an awful murder. They wondered if Al had invited the man in, or if he had broke in and forced him into the basement, or maybe even snuck up on him somehow. But it didn't take long for police to find a suspect, and it wasn't a break-in, or anything like that. Instead, it was a little more dark. See, Al had lived alone in a 2-story townhouse, which had way more room than he needed, so he eventually ended up turning the basement into an apartment that he could rent out. And just months prior to this, the tenant that had so long lived in that apartment had decided to move out, leaving Al to search for a new tenant. He did this by putting an ad in local papers and waited. One of the first people to respond to the ad was a man who identified himself as Robert Cooper and wanted to move in as soon as possible. He was even willing to provide a security deposit and the first month's rent to make it happen. We know about this because Al would tell his girlfriend Linda about it. He also revealed this man had came from the East Coast to work at Wells Fargo. Unfortunately for Linda, she would only see the man once and made an excuse to leave, and she felt like he did not want her to see him at all. And even though she didn't get a great look at him, she did know he was dressed well, wearing nice pants and a suit coat. She also described him as being in his 40s, 5'8", 180 pounds with dark wavy hair, and most notable of all, he walked with a limp and had to use a cane. But as mentioned, this was a very brief encounter, and she could relay no more than that about the man. But thankfully, a few other people would contact police with information. A professor at the University of Colorado would come forward and stated that she owned property she was renting out, and a man matching the same exact description of this man, going by the name Robert, showed up to discuss the property with her. However, this man didn't have a limp nor a cane, but she did notice something else. He had an accent, and luckily, she was an expert in Eastern European languages and connected it to Romania. But it wasn't just her. Apparently this man had approached several renters in the days and weeks leading up to Al's untimely demise. At least 3 of these renters would describe him as having different characteristics though. Sometimes he had a different accent, sometimes his mannerisms were different. It was almost like he was playing a different character every time he met one of these potential landlords. This ultimately led to very different descriptions, like some who said he was in his mid-30s, while one said early 50s, although later on, police would state that this witness was most likely mistaken about that age and about him being on a cane. And there is somewhat of a contradiction there, because some sources say Linda also reported the man being on the cane, while other sources state she did not report that. And as far as any danger the man presented, only one woman recalled she got creeped out after watching him move through her home, because he stopped and studied every window little by little, which made her uneasy, and ultimately she did not rent to him. But other witnesses came forward, and these were neighbors of Al. One of these men would state that they tried to engage Robert in conversation and was completely ignored. Another neighbor, a female, stated she seen him on a nearby walking trail, and he stared at her as they passed but would not speak. But for the timeline and how that actually went, detectives are not sure. What is known is Al drove his girlfriend to the airport that Saturday, and when she landed around 3:30 p.m., she called him, and Al told her that him and a neighbor just fixed a pipe in the basement, and then Al and Linda said goodbye. And that was it until they found the body on Monday. In that time frame, no one else heard from him, so the attack happened sometime after 3:30 and sometime before that night. And what happened afterwards, a lot of that was left to conjecture, but some of it is known. Apparently the man did go up into the kitchen where he began to eat Al's food. He then took a shower in the master bathroom. He even slept in Al's bed and wore some of his clothing. Early the next morning, he left, which is known because of a neighbor. However, the man took the time to do a very thorough cleaning of the home, like super thorough. There was not one fingerprint found in the home, and bleach had been poured down the shower drain to destroy any forensic evidence. In addition, 6 to 12 knives were left in the plugged sink, and then bleach was poured in. There was also a drinking glass, a pen, a dishwasher scrubber, and Al's car keys. So there was almost zero in the way of real forensic evidence, but police were left with a motive at least. They believed that this almost had to be a crime of passion, citing the torture he had been put through. But there were issues with this. For one, Al didn't really have any enemies. Secondly, why would this person, who apparently had this much hate for Al, try to rent from so many other people? Detectives now felt the crime of passion motive could be dropped, so they speculated it was a robbery, since hey, there were a couple of things missing, mainly his vehicle and cell phone. But Al's truck would actually be found later that day, just a block and a half from the home. In his truck, they did find trace amounts of DNA that would later submit to a forensic database. They also searched Al's garbage can and found some evidence that provided some optimism to the detectives. Inside was a discarded rental application, which had been handwritten by this mysterious man, who put his name as Robert Cooper. Not only did he put that, but he also put his mailing address, which he actually said was his sister's address, and he also put his social security number and phone number. But, of course, when investigators began running down this info, they soon found that the address belonged to the University of Colorado's medical school campus, and the social security number was traced to a woman who had no connection to the case whatsoever, while the phone number was traced to a burner phone, one that had been turned on 30 days before this. Detectives then began to trace the phone, along with Al's phone, and they were surprised to learn that both of them were moving through the Denver area, and the police would eventually track them down, as they had been abandoned in an area where the homeless often hung around. Presumably, the killer knew they would be picked up and used by transients. They would recover the burner phone though, and began trying to find where it came from. They soon learned it had been purchased near the University of Colorado Medical School. the second connection to the school. They also found that the number had been used on several rental applications and had been used to call several potential renters, up to 100. They would now begin to focus their investigation on the University of Colorado and soon found that several advertisements had been placed on flyers at the Colorado's library, and some of these ads, and here's the important part, had been posted only in the library, nowhere else, not in the newspapers, not in ads. This was huge. Then, another lead breathed hope into the investigation. Looking over Al's financial records revealed that Al's ATM card had been used on the night of the murder, and when they found Al's pickup truck, it also had these ATM receipts inside. This led to the location of the ATM where the card had been used at a nearby Wells Fargo, the place the man was supposed to be employed. This ATM, thankfully, had a built-in camera, but unfortunately, the man known as Robert would hide his face with a ski mask while he made the withdrawal. You could only see part of the face. The man also wore gloves which hid any fingerprints. But instead of reinforcing their theory that this was a robbery, it actually ruled it out, because it was found that the man only took $1,000 from the bank account, in spite of the fact that Al had much more that he could have taken. And he had access to it all weekend, but still didn't try to get it, drawing the cash once, and that was it. After getting the money, the killer then took Al's vehicle back and dropped it off where it was found. He then took the keys back inside and dropped them off in the bleach with the other items and left. Police were now left with the most unsettling theory. Maybe this killer planned all of this out for one reason, just so he could torture and murder someone. Detectives also felt, because of the actions took, that he most likely killed before, and was probably a serial killer. They believed it was unlikely that he had been stalking Al or had picked him from the get-go. Instead, it seemed like he was taking a look at all the locations to see which would be the best to actually pull this off, and which victim would be the easiest to do it to. And since Al's girlfriend was out of town that week, it unfortunately meant Al made the best victim. And this is often where we see Israel Key's name pop up. He was 26 years old at that time, however, and puts him out of the age range of the description provided by witnesses. Although it's possible he did use a disguise, people that believe it was him often point to the method of his crimes, basically going anywhere and everywhere across the country to commit the murders. Often flying to an airport, getting a rental car, and then driving thousands of miles to pull it off. And they also point to the ATM footage, which shows the heavily hidden face, which bears an uncanny resemblance to Key's. But Keyes would be eliminated as a suspect due to the DNA recovered, which we will come back to. Detectives also suggested whoever this was from the East Coast, and really thought it was a good chance he came from New Jersey. They believed he did have some connection to the banking industry, specifically Wells Fargo, and he was familiar with the University of Colorado Hospital. They knew this because even though he had moved around the area while they were tracking both cell phones, they seen he spent a considerable amount of time near the hospital. Investigators were also convinced that he had a female relative in the area, and while they thought this, they never elaborated on. But one thing police found odd in all this was in 2004, it wasn't widely known that the police could track cell phone pinging locations, and after this man hung around the hospital for a while, he went and dropped the phones off near a transient encampment, which suggests he knew the police would track his cell phone, and he might be former law enforcement. But not only because of that, it was also because he seemed to be playing mind games with the police, and they started to theorize that maybe he had tried to become a police officer in the past and was rejected, or maybe he did become a police officer and eventually got fired, and they now believed he was toying with them because of that. But what if it wasn't that, or it wasn't a thrill kill? Well, in the decades since, detectives have kicked around a couple more theories, one being it may have been tied to Al's career, such as him being involved with large engineering projects, such as the Surrey nuclear plant and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, and there might actually be something to this. In fact, there's a very similar unsolved murder that occurred just years before Al's, and it was during the time Al worked at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California that this other man also worked there, named Lee Hall. Lee was the lead designer for a project in which the goal was to achieve nuclear fusion, but it's Lee that would discover a flaw, that being a 5-degree difference regarding a laser's alignment, something that could cost millions to fix. and considering the project was already 5 years late and $350 million in the hole, nobody listened. Until September of 1999, when the higher-ups realized that, hey, Lee and his team were right, we have to fix this, and it costed them $1 million to do so. And it worked out good for Lee, who received a substantial pay raise, but just a month after that, he didn't show up for work, and just like Al, his co-workers become concerned. They eventually drove to his home, and when they got there, they found the side gate to his home left open and the front door unlocked, which was unlike Lee. They found the TV on and Lee's glasses sitting in the kitchen, while Lee was lying face down in his bedroom floor. This too was a gruesome scene. He had been beaten and stabbed and left with an odd scratch on his face, possibly from a ring. There was nothing left at the scene though. No sign of a struggle, nothing. His death was eventually ruled a homicide that occurred at 1 a.m. because one neighbor heard a car at the home around that time, which was Lee's car. And just like Al, the car was found a block away. His wallet was found inside, and nothing had been stolen, except the keys were never found in this case. This murder has never been solved either, and some detectives believe the two could be connected. There's also the case of James Duckett, a man in Kentucky who was tortured and murdered just 4 years later in 2008. Both crimes were very similar, and the killer left, took James's truck to an ATM, got some cash, and then took the truck back and left it just a few miles away from James's home, just like in the case with Al. The only difference in this one is police have said, in James's case, something personal was stolen, but they have never revealed what that was. So, could all three of these cases be connected? That is still unknown. But as far as Al's case goes, in December of 2017, police used the DNA found at the crime scene to update their description of the suspect, which also confirmed that he was of Southeastern European ancestry, possibly from the Balkans. And within the past couple of years, they've even announced that they have identified relatives of his in Romania using genetic genealogy. There's a good possibility this one gets solved fairly soon, and it's going to be huge news when it happens. January 1st, 1985, Eastern Airlines Flight 980 would disembark from Paraguay to Miami. The flight was mostly empty, 19 passengers and 10 crew with scheduled stopovers in Bolivia and Ecuador. And it was at this stop in Bolivia, at La Paz, that was known to be difficult. For one, the ground controllers had no radar, and two, what navigational equipment they did have was spotty at best. So it had to heavily rely on the cockpit crew to track their own position. Making matters worse is the airport here is the highest international airport in the world, sitting at over 13,000 feet. The air is so thin that planes land at 200 miles an hour because if they did the typical 140, they would fall out of the sky. Air brakes also take longer, so the runway is double the normal length. Not only that, but the pilots per regulation have to wear oxygen masks as they start to drop down towards the runway. So, suffice to say, it's not for the rookie pilot. And it has a lot to do with this next strange mystery, because on this New Year's night, around 8:38 p.m., the plane would radio in about 30 miles away from the airport and was given the okay to land. So the plane cruising right along at 20,000 feet was given the clear to begin its descent before landing, and before it could even get to 18,000 feet, tragedy would strike. There in the middle of its path was Mount Illimani, and somehow, Flight 980 would hit nose first into the backside of the mountain, right below the summit. It most likely cartwheeled forward and splattered parts across the mountain. Residents in the nearby valley said the whole area shook. Meanwhile, the airport stated the only thing that came over the radio was a single click. And because it crashed into the mountain, it would make finding the aircraft very difficult. In fact, because of this location, it would take the Bolivian Air Force a full day to even locate the crash site. And by that time, a storm had done dumped several feet of snow on it, and avalanches after this basically prevented anyone from reaching the site. Soon, the NTSB and the Airline Pilots Association, the two organizations that investigate crashes by U.S. airlines, would leave with a Bolivian team to go look. But it didn't take them long to realize none of them were built to do the climbing that is required to get there. And here's where we come to one of the first big problems with this mystery. Because Peru actually offered to loan Bolivia the helicopters needed to make it to the crash site, but the Bolivian government didn't want their citizens to know that Peru had better helicopters, so they declined. A pretty dumb move. However, they would eventually give in and accept the offer, and I'm gonna guess that's because of pressure from the US. They began making a plan to reach the crash site, which involved the searchers jumping out of the chopper and skiing towards the scene. But they soon realized that a chopper couldn't hover at that altitude, so an American company sent an experimental high-altitude helicopter to go to the site. Unfortunately, this required a mechanic to travel with the helicopter and then put it together once it reached Bolivia. And when these mechanics arrived, they were so altitude sick that they couldn't do anything for days. And once they finally got better and put the helicopter together, the weather was too bad. So it was a complete disaster, and it would get stranger. Apparently, just 2 days after the crash, Bolivian climber Bernardo Guarachi just decided to go up to the site on foot, and he would make it to the crash site and look around and left without telling anyone. And he wouldn't even be mentioned in the final report, and it would be decades before we found out who sent him or if he randomly went on his own, and we will come back to him. A full 2 months would pass after this when a private expedition was finally launched, after a flight engineer who was scheduled to be on that flight, but swapped shifts with another engineer, contacted a small group of Bolivian mountain climbers. They would make their way through the dangers of rock and ice and found wreckage and luggage, but unfortunately, they couldn't find the plane's black box. Even stranger, there were no bodies or blood anywhere. 4 months after this, another private expedition was launched, and again 3 months later. But this time, they were followed by the NTSB, and on both occasions, neither expedition could make it more than a day at the crash site. Over the next 3 decades, at least 5 expeditions were launched, and nothing substantial was found. No human remains and no black box, which meant they still had no idea why it crashed. I mean, they know it hit a mountainside, but why? No one knew. And of course, when there's not an answer, it goes from mystery to conspiracy. Soon, many South American journalists and families of the victims all began to speculate different reasons. Was it an equipment malfunction? First-time crew not familiar with the landing? Bad weather? The Paraguayan mafia blew it up because the country's richest man was on board? Was Eastern Airlines running drugs? Or were they trying to assassinate the US ambassador to Paraguay who just happened to change plans at the last minute and avoided the flight? Even though these all sound ridiculous, there were some very real reasons for speculation. For one, 5 members of Paraguay's most prominent family, the Matalones, were famous for their huge company which sold home appliances. These 5 family members were on the flight. While that US ambassador, Arthur Davis, did change plans at the last minute, but his wife, Marion Davis, still boarded the flight and lost her life. Likewise, an investigation after the flight eventually came up with 22 criminal indictments against baggage handlers that revealed for 3 years the airline had been delivering weekly shipments of 300 pounds of cocaine from South America to Miami. So it just totally gave a real possibility that one of these conspiracies were true. The case, however, would take a bit of a turn in 2016 when a man named Dan Futrell would stumble upon a Wikipedia list of unrecovered flight recorders. After going down the rabbit hole, he found Eastern Airlines Flight 980 and was intrigued when the article said it could not be recovered because of inaccessible terrain. He took this as a challenge, and he and his roommate, Isaac Stoner, began planning on a trip to Bolivia to search for the black box. And they actually began a 5-month training plan, which included sleeping in an altitude simulation tent. And their plan was not to search the crash site, but a 1-mile square patch below it, where they believed glacial runoff would have pushed everything down. So they would begin their ascent with their guide, and 4 hours later, they set up a camp among some ruins. And they already began finding plane parts, although they believed they were actually brought in by the locals and left here. But the next day, they would make their way to the area they had spent months planning on searching. And when they got there, it didn't take long to find a body part. The first one since the accident 31 years ago. It was a femur with skin, muscle, and fat still attached, which meant it had been frozen not long after impact, and it had been sheared off in the crash. After this, they found even more bones just a few feet away, while parts of the glacier melted in the sunlight and revealed more plane parts and more bones. And There were just plane parts everywhere. A fuselage here, a jet engine there, wiring and toggle switches, seat belts, and children's shoes. And this would ultimately lead to more questions like, how come the expeditions before didn't find anything? See, this is where things divulge and the conspiracy begins. The only thing America and Bolivia agree on is that Bernardo Garacci did make it to the crash site the day after. He would not speak about it to anyone afterwards. This led to a long-running conspiracy that he was paid by someone to go up and look for something very specific. Allegedly, there was $20 million in a duffel bag that was being carried by one of the Matalons. Actually, Enrique Matalon, the richest man in Paraguay. In fact, one expedition in 2006 even went to look for this bag of money, but only found children's clothing and crocodile, lizard, and snake skins, which were most likely being smuggled to Miami to be made into black market goods like shoes and handbags. But what if Bernardo was not there looking for $20 million, but instead was there to find the black box? That has long been suspected, but why? That's also a strange part in all this. Apparently, the NTSB didn't even bother to interview him, let alone the Bolivian government. And even though he continues to be a climbing guide and has stated he is open to being interviewed, and he finally was, after the body parts were found in 2016. And according to him, he was contacted by a man from the US Embassy, a Royce Victa, who asked to meet him on a short notice, so short that Bernardo didn't even get to grab his camera. They took a helicopter to the mountain where the Bolivian military was already setting up, and after camping there that night, they went up the mountain the next day. He claimed they found wreckage everywhere. There were open suitcases, papers from the cockpit, crocodile skins, and shoes. They looked for the black box, but couldn't find it. Even stranger, there were no bodies or any remains, nor were there any blood. He said it had disintegrated. They were able to camp there that night though, and got word they would be resupplied by air and joined by another investigator who was to come to them on skis. And if you remember, that was the original plan that was cancelled, and Bernardo never got any supplies and they had to descend. When they made it back down, they were detained by the military and taken to different tents and had all their bags searched. They were even made to take their clothes off and were checked. And it was also here that Bernardo revealed that he was threatened by these interrogators, so he lied about what he really seen and never came forward. But that wasn't the only people that made it there. Not long after him, a man named William Kelly and his wife Judith began months of getting into shape and learning how to mountain climb, and they made it to the crash site with no problem. She began calling on Eastern Airlines to do a real investigation, and it's worth noting here, Eastern Airlines went under just a few years later. But Judith began going on talk shows, putting pressure on Eastern Airlines to do something, but they ignored her. But if we go back to Dan and Isaac and their expedition in 2016, after looking over everything, they came to their own conclusion. They found out that this was this pilot's second landing at this airport, while it was the captain's first. There was also a language barrier, and on top of this, the lack of radar. And a storm hit southeast of the airport that added to the problems. And with a more experienced crew, they probably would have went south around the storm, but this crew went north. And you can also add to the fact that the other airlines had these very detailed maps with the terrain hazards labeled prominently, which would have enabled this to have all been avoided. But as you may have guessed, Eastern Airlines didn't have these maps. Because of all these reasons, it was most likely just a horrible accident due to a bunch of errors, mainly Eastern Airlines' fault. The bigger mystery in all this is, where is the black box and flight recorder? Alright guys, you know what time it is. It's Small Mystery Roundup time, where I take the mysteries that aren't very long, or don't fit well with the rest of the video, or just aren't interesting, and roll them up into one little section. We start off with the Warren Serial Pooper. Another layer, another pooper, and they just keep getting more degenerate the deeper we go into the iceberg. This time, our defecating demon would strike in Warren, Michigan, and this one is particularly egregious. As employees in an auto service shop began to push their van into their workshop, they were overcome with the stench coming from inside, and they opened the door to see someone had stopped by to do a little business. They immediately went to review their security cam footage and seen a man walking over to this van opening the door, taking his pants halfway down, and then let go inside, wiping off on some napkins, which he then threw on the ground. What makes this one particularly interesting is, this was the first time in the auto shop's history that they did not lock one of the customers' doors, which is what they typically do. However, this van had some kind of issue that would not allow it to lock. On top of that, it was also the first time in their history that anyone even tried to break into the lot, and he seemingly only done so to go take a dump in this van. Go figure. Next is white holes. A white hole is a hypothetical cosmic object that is basically the opposite of a black hole. While black holes pull matter in with an intense gravitational field from which nothing can escape, white holes would expel matter and energy, allowing nothing to enter. The concept of a white hole comes from the equations of general relativity, which predicts that if black holes exist, a counterpart solution could theoretically exist as well, but it's still just hypothetical. And that's all for this edition of the Small Mystery Roundup. Let's get back to the video. This next little segment, I decided to combine two very similar mysteries since they don't warrant a full segment on their own. The 1458 eruption refers to a mysterious volcanic eruption believed to have occurred in 1458. That, of course, was discovered by finding sulfate spikes in ice cores taken from Antarctica. When first discovered decades ago, it was believed to have actually occurred in 1452 or 1453. However, more accurate testing in 2012 revealed that the eruption actually occurred in 1458. This was also confirmed by looking at tree rings in the northern hemisphere that would have formed in the summer of 1459, and these revealed that temperatures dropped by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And some of the historical records from Europe and Eastern Asia in the following years reported smoggy and hazy skies multiple times, as well as the sun being blue and seeing volcanic ash. There was also increases in precipitation. Interestingly, it was also noted that the freezing temperatures and excessive rainfall led to many famines, resulting in a number of people starving to death, which consequently led to militaries in Europe receiving less funding due to dealing with these disasters. In addition, the sulfate deposited during this event marked the largest record in ice cores in the last 700 years, meaning it was one heck of an eruption. But the mystery is, where was this eruption? One suggestion is the southern Pacific Ocean, at a former landmass known as Kauai, which is in the general area of the island of Tonga. It was destroyed by a volcanic eruption and sunk into the sea sometime in the 15th century. But on the Tonga Island cluster, radiocarbon datings have found thick pyroclastic flows, stuff like volcanic ash and rock fragments, that date back to between 1410 and 1450 AD, which puts it a little bit before our mystery. However, analysts of that magma determined it could have been capable of producing the greatest amount of sulfate in the last 700 years, like the ice cores showed. But none of the surrounding islands show this much deposited, meaning it might not be it. Likewise, Tofua is a volcanic island in Tonga that similar studies have been documented on, and it is shown it might be on the island, as the data shows a significant eruption occurred there between 1440 and 1640 AD. Next, we look at the 1808 Mystery Eruption, which you guessed it, occurred in 1808. But on this one, it's possible that it was actually multiple volcanic eruptions, which then led to a period of global cooling and to what would become known as the year without a summer, that of 1816, when temperatures dropped all around the globe. That was actually discovered in the 1990s. It was known to climatologists as the Little Ice Age, and it started in the early 1810s, and just like before, they studied ice cores, and this time, in addition to the Antarctic, they looked at ice cores from Greenland and found a sulfate spike in 1809. However, it was a weak spike, not even half as strong as the one that would occur 6 years later in 1815. So hence the problem. There's no eruptions recorded in this time that correlates with the spike of sulfate found. Even stranger is tree ring data also points to an eruption that happened in 1808, and it was during this time that a lot of the world was becoming inhabited, and news would travel a lot quicker than it used to. And because of this, you would think someone would have been bound to have reported a huge eruption. So that suggests that not one huge eruption happened, but probably an abnormally large amount that hit that year. Most likely, in the tropical and subtropical regions of the world. Now there are a couple of known significant eruptions that happened in 1808. One happened in the Azores on May 1st through May 4th, and there was one in the Philippines in March, but neither of these correspond with the data found. However, at the Astronomical Observatory of Bogota between 1805 and 1810, the director reported a transparent cloud that obstructs the sun. This was recorded on December 11th, 1808, and was widely visible across Colombia, along with unusually cold weather and frost. South of that in Peru, similar observations were made in Lima. This all goes to suggest that the eruption happened somewhere within a few days of December 4th, 1808, and that the volcano was probably somewhere west of South America, out in the Pacific, on an island. At this time in the Southwest Pacific, there were very few European settlements, which means there were very little reportings being made, other than the occasional one made by a passing explorer. Because of all this, it's thought the eruptions probably happened between Indonesia and Tonga, yet no one is quite sure. August 9th, 1894. At around 7:30 p.m., a train would depart the station in Fairbury, Nebraska, heading on its way towards Lincoln, about 2 hours away. The ride was pretty uneventful most of the way, but that would change just 20 minutes outside of its intended destination. It would come up on a 400-foot long trestle just southwest of town that was used to cross Salt Creek, something it had done numerous times before, but tonight, disaster would strike. Because as the train engine went over, the rails began to spread apart. Soon, the passenger cars would speed out over the trestle, and the weight was just too much, and the entire train fell into the water below. And unfortunately, upon impact, the engine exploded, throwing hot coals all over the train and wooden trestle, and soon, both were on fire. Witnesses at the scene noted the night sky was bright red and screams of pain were heard from below, a scene that I imagine terrified residents. Luckily, 3 men were able to escape almost immediately, but the rest were stuck inside. These 3 men were Colonel C.J. Beals and J. McDowell and crewman Harry Foote. Just looking at the first car, it's pretty obvious none of these people survived, so they quickly went to the back and found the rear car, where they helped rescue 15 passengers. Harry, though, went beast mode. In spite of having a broke leg, he climbed down into the wreck and pulled out 2 fellow crewmen. Meanwhile, Beals and McDowell ran to get help, and the first building they seen was the state penitentiary about 2 miles away, whom they made contact with, and the fire and the police department were both called. Another train would reach town about 40 minutes later and carried the survivors on to Lincoln, but unfortunately, because of the location of the wreck, the fire department wasn't able to get to the crash, so they just stood and watched it burn down. Of the 35 passengers on board, 11 died in the crash. Now what would at first seem like an awful accident that was simply tragic, well, things got a bit mysterious quickly, because survivors of the crash would talk to the police while they were waiting on the other train to arrive, and they told them that they had seen an unknown man holding a lantern near the trestle right after the crash, and detectives did search the scene, and lo and behold, it was an act of sabotage. Someone had pulled the spikes from the trestle, and wrench marks were found on the rail, along with gouges in the railroad ties, which showed a crowbar had been used to pry them apart. A further search revealed in the grass nearby the trestle lay a 40-pound crowbar. No one knows why someone would do this, but within 2 days, police already had their man. They set their sights on a man named George Washington Davis. Now detectives really had nothing on Davis, other than the fact that some of the survivors said he was the man they seen holding the lantern at the wreck. In fact, it was Harry Foote that reported seeing a large black man running away with a lantern. But Davis had an answer for this. He claimed he had been in a club and ran 4 miles from there to see the wreck. However, there were problems with this. First of all, his timeline of events don't correspond with reality. Like, when they asked him about the sound of the crash, he told them it wasn't too bad until the engine blew up, but the engine blew up on impact when Davis was allegedly at the club. So how did he hear it blow up while he was running towards the crash? Davis, too, had a criminal record, which included theft, and he had done a stint in prison before. And upon his arrest, he was found with a lantern and revolver, although I would assume most people had both of those back then. Likewise, other members of the African American community, who many were at that club, gave an alibi for him. Not to mention, the police had nothing, and investigators could not come up with a motive, although they originally believed it was a robbery attempt. Likewise, Davis never confessed, but he would be tried twice. The first time, they tried for first-degree murder, and it ended up being a hung jury. The second trial, and this is crazy, the judge actually told the jury that if the prosecutor can't convince them of first-degree murder, they should convict him of second-degree murder anyways. And that's exactly what happened, and Davis was sent away. But 10 years later, the governor paroled him, citing lack of evidence and motive, and he had serious doubts that he was involved. To this day, it's officially the largest unsolved crime in Lincoln, and along with Charles Starkweather's killing spree, it's the largest instance of mass murder in Nebraska. This brings us to the conclusion of Part 26 of the Unsolved Mysteries Mega Iceberg Explained. We have just finished Layer 8, and we have 3 more to go. Also, as a reminder, if you guys want to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, which I've not done a great job at promoting. So, if you want to help the channel, you can take a look around there. But for the video, I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.